Good evening. I'm Stewart Brand from the Long Now Foundation. How many were at Friday night's do with Ed Wilson? My God, look at this. Okay, it's been biology week, and it's going to keep being biology week. I think a peculiarity of these long now-ish talks is that so many of them wind up being whole earthish. Ed was the subject of his book, The Social Domination of Earth, Social Conquest of Earth. And then we had Mark Linus talking about the Anthropocene, basically the 9 barriers that basically could limit human and other life on this planet that humans have somewhat overdone. Planet, 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 whole Earth, whole Earth. And here comes Charles C. Mann, who limited himself to the Americas the last time with 1491. Just 2 years later, suddenly he's whole Earth, 1493, and it's the Homogenocene this time. Let's travel with him, Charles C. Mann.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. This is all working? Right. I thought I'd start at the beginning. As many of you probably learned in school, 200 million years ago, the Earth consisted of a single giant landmass, scientists call Pangea. Geological forces broke it up, forever separating the continents, and forever separating the inhabitants of those continents, creating completely separate ecosystems that effectively didn't touch each other for tens of millions of years. Completely different suites of plants and animals that about 500 years ago were suddenly brought together by this guy. One of the ways I got started in this whole subject was about 15 years ago. My parents demanded that I come back to my childhood home and clear out the stuff that I'd left there since I'd gone to college. Any of you who are parents will recognize the kind of wayward child that I was. And I opened up all the boxes of junk that I had in the attic, and I discovered, to my chagrin, my 8th grade American history textbook from Highland Junior High School, which I had never returned. And right in the front was this picture here of Christopher Columbus, and I stared at it kind of riveted, because as I looked at it, I realized that there were many things that were wrong with this picture, and not just the fact that everybody in it looks like George Washington. From a modern perspective, what we recognize about Columbus is that he and the people who came over with him were not alone on those ships. This picture shows basically nothing but people, but in fact, huge numbers of passengers went on the ships of Columbus and his successors. And so a more realistic picture would look something like this. Because Columbus inaugurated what the wonderful historian Alfred Crosby has called the Columbian exchange, which was this period of time that we still live in today, where huge numbers of creatures from over there came over here, huge numbers of creatures from over here came over there. It was the biggest ecological convulsion since the death of the dinosaurs, and it shapes human history as well. From a biological point of view, however, this could be said not just to be an exchange of the kind of thing that I've been talking about in human history, but something that they've called the Homogenocene. And it comes from the idea that the Earth's ecosystems are being put in a blender and homogenized. And I also like the idea that it comes from homogeneous, human generated. The term was coined by Michael Samways and has been abused by me for a few years now. But the idea is that this is this period that we live in now. It's the beginning of globalization. It all starts with Columbus, and its import is as much ecological as it is economic. And one way to think about it is shown here. This is a Dutch genre painting. There's many of these kind of paintings, and what they effectively show is lower middle class people living in barns. And this is the way the countless numbers of people in Europe, Asia, and Africa live for thousands of years after agriculture. And they're sitting there surrounded by their domestic animals. Now, the reason that this is important is that, as we know from things like bird flu, every now and then a human disease becomes an animal disease jumps the species barrier, as scientists say, and becomes a human disease. And so from an epidemiologist's point this is what the picture looks like. So here you have the cow, which is the source of bovine rinderpest, which is the ancestor of measles and tuberculosis. You have the poultry, which we know from influenza, also whooping cough or pertussis. The horse in the background there is equine encephalitis and probably smallpox. And then up in the rafters here, you have bats, which are the source of rabies. And so huge numbers of people in Europe, Asia, and Africa spent their lives swimming in a kind of bacterial and viral soup all their lives. And this was a major factor in the way that they lived. Now, let's go to the Americas, before Columbus, in this period of time when there was no contact. And you see here a typical Powhatan longhouse. The Powhatan were the people that were encountered by John Smith and those people in Chesapeake Bay in the 1600s. And so if you're an architect, you look at this house and you say it's essentially the same as the barn we saw in the previous picture. It's a structure held up by timbers lashed together. There's no windows, there's no chimney. It's effectively the same building. The big difference here is that every animal in the picture is dead. It's like Sarah Palin's dream house. And the reason for this is that by a quirk of evolutionary history that we can talk about if you're curious to learn more about it, that at the time of Columbus, there were very, very few domesticable animals in the Americas. There are no cattle, there are no horses, there are no sheep, there are no goats, there's no poultry. There's none of the familiar domestic animals, nor any analogs to them. And so the peoples of the Americas did not spend their time swimming in this kind of bacterial and viral soup. There's an enormous difference there. And so in the first 150 years or so after Columbus, the big part of the exchange was invisible, these microorganisms. And on the right-hand side of this picture here is a partial list of the organisms that crossed the Atlantic from Europe to the Americas in the first 150 years. And on the left-hand side is a pretty complete list of the ones that went the other way. And this enormous epidemiological imbalance, I would argue, is the most important fact that your kids should probably learn about American history since Columbus. Because when these diseases came, imported inadvertently by Europeans in the first 150 years after Columbus, the result was that somewhere between 2/3 and 95% of the original inhabitants of the Americas died. It was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. There's been nothing like it before or after, thank God. And it was an absolutely extraordinary event that goes a tremendously long way towards explaining why small groups of poorly equipped Europeans at the ends of very long supply chains were able to establish themselves in ecosystems that were utterly unlike anything that they had seen before. Absent this mammoth and one-sided exchange of microorganisms, it's very difficult to understand how my ancestors and many of the ancestors of the people in this room would have got here. Now it wasn't the only impact that it had on the human world. One of the pleasures of working on this book that I recently published was that a little bit of it appeared in National Geographic, and I got to work with a wonderful illustration and map staff there. And we contacted about 20 or so anthropologists, archaeologists, and ecologists who work on the history of the landscapes of the eastern seaboard, and we asked them what the area that they studied looked like at Columbus' time in 1500. And we put their answers together and compiled this map. Now this isn't to be understood as some perfect pixel by pixel recreation. It's an indicative map. And what we're trying to show is that the human imprint on the east coast of the Americas was extremely heavy. All these areas that are lighter green were cleared by fire for agriculture, and even the areas that we show forest, most of them were open by today's standards because native people burned the undergrowth every year to encourage the kind of tender new shoots that would bring in the kind of game that they like to hunt. And so, in fact, the forests were so open and park-like that people like John Smith reported being able to ride at a full gallop through the woods, and he was crazy enough that he might have actually have done it. So you have a landscape that looks like this. Then, very quickly after Columbus, all the people who were maintaining this landscape die. And the result is a mammoth reforestation of the landscape. The first impact of Europeans on the Americas, because this is repeated throughout the Americas, is this huge reforestation. And the wilderness that is celebrated by Thoreau and John Muir and people like that was largely an inadvertent European creation. And a lot of Native people don't have the same feelings about it because for them it's a cemetery. And so this picture that we have, that I certainly grew up with, of this sort of trackless forest, and in that same 8th grade American history textbook talks about how a squirrel could go from tree to tree to tree all the way from Cape Cod to the Mississippi River. That image that we have of the great American wilderness dates back from this time, and it was something that my ancestors saw, and when they came here in the 18th century, but they didn't realize that it was in fact a recent phenomenon. Now, if you think about it, when you look at this kind of phenomenon, what are the cessation of fires, the regrowth of trees? What you're talking about is a dramatic drop of carbon levels in the air. And so in recent years, lots of scientific papers have appeared that have this kind of incomprehensible looking graph. And the point here is not to try and have you understand this graph, because it is kind of incomprehensible, but to try to convince you that these kinds of graphs exist. And what they are researchers attempting to measure the carbon levels, carbon dioxide levels in the air 500 years ago. And what they typically show is that they plummet. Right after Columbus, carbon dioxide levels plummet, and you can see it in lots of different measures, like the little bubbles of gas trapped in Arctic ice, which can be read, kind of like tree rings, because they get built up every year. It's done in the bottom and here of Central American lakes. It's also done by tree growth records and isotope counts, and there's all these kinds of things that suggest that there's this huge down drop in the level of carbon dioxide in the air, and this is I think the leading theory, an explanation for a period of time called the Little Ice Age, which is about a 250-year cold snap that begins in about 1550 and ends in about 1800, causes very, very cold temperatures throughout the northern hemisphere for that 250-year period, and ends up in the creation of yet another Dutch genre painting style, and what it is of the little kids skating on the canals. And I love this picture, and I read an entire extremely dull biography of Peter Bruegel, a service I performed for you to try and find out when he actually painted it, and after 350 turgid pages, I discovered that this had actually been painted in late April and early May. If any of you have been to the Netherlands, it's been a very long time since the Netherlands looked like this in April and May. And so what you're seeing here then in this kind of shin bone connected to the knee bone, connected to the ankle bone, or what way, is the kind of back and forth cross currents around the world that lead me, and I would argue increasingly most historians, to say that this period of globalization, this period of time when one part of the world is all mixed up with another part of the world, really begins with Columbus and ends up being as much ecological as economic. Now, none of our ancestors, none of the Europeans involved, nor none of the native people actually thought about things in this terms. This is a modern attempt to impose some kind of order on the past. What they were thinking about was shown here. And from their point of view, the most important event after Columbus was shown here, which is when in southern Bolivia, the Spaniards discovered Potosi, which is the biggest silver strike in history by a huge margin. And it was essentially as close to a mountain of pure silver as geology allows. It was just a vast expansion in the world's money supply, because most of the world used silver for money supply. The world supply of precious metals doubled or even tripled in the century or so after the discovery of Potosi. And from the Europeans' point of view, what happened is this gush of silver washed in. They were kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies. Before Western Europe had been a relatively poor part of the world, suddenly this vast sum of money just sort of throws in their laps, and they begin to be able to throw their weight around. And so, like anybody who's just had a windfall, what the Europeans do is go shopping. And so they get the silver here. A bunch of it crosses the Pacific to Spain's outpost in Manila, which is established in 1571, and then they bring silk, porcelain, slaves, and spices over here to Mexico, add tobacco and sugar and so forth, ends up in Spain. They buy guns and horses, which are used to get the slaves, which are used to mine the silver, and so you have this loop of commerce that involves every habitable part of the ocean, starting in the 16th century. And in fact, at one point, my editor suggested that my book should be called "Ha Ha, Tom Friedman, the world has been flat for 400 years." But we decided that this wasn't actually that commercial, and So we were stuck with 1493. But again, the impact from, as we think of it now, was, as much or more ecological than economic, because on those ships came huge numbers of organisms, and that had this enormous effect. And one of the most important from the European point of view is the potato. These are what actually potatoes look like if you go to small villages in the Andes. They've been developed there for thousands of years. In the Andes, they grow potatoes in every conceivable ecological condition for every conceivable taste. There's almost 6,000 known varieties that are in the International Potato Center in Lima. And the first time I saw this kind of thing, I was in a small town in the Andes, and I saw these strange-looking objects. And so I said to the people selling them, "What are you selling?" And they said, "Potatoes." And I said, "No, those things over there. What are those? Potatoes." And I felt like, what are they doing? Spoofing the gringo? And I said, "No, what are those?" And finally, I got through my thick head that they were potatoes, and that my idea of the potato was, from their point of view, woefully unimaginative. So this tiny slice of the available selection of potatoes makes its way to Europe. And after a period of resistance, because Europeans don't grow tubers and they don't, in this way, and they don't really understand how they work, they are adopted. Now, I should tell you a little bit about the way the potatoes are grown in the Andes, because they're grown in this kind of ridge and furrow system. And so that people plant carve the land into these ridges and furrows and plant the potatoes on top of the ridges. And the reason for doing this, you can see here, the ridges, even though it's just this much difference between the top and the bottom, the ridges are substantially warmer than the furrows. And obviously high up in the Andes, that makes a big difference. But also they're substantially drier. And so you can see here, in this snowfall and potato season, that the tops are considerably less snow, considerably drier than the ridges and furrows. It turns out that that if you want to grow potatoes, a big problem with them is fungus-type diseases, and funguses don't like warm, dry areas. They prefer cool, wet areas. And so this way of growing it turns out to be a pretty good way of preventing fungi. Now, the Europeans, again, don't really know about this. What they do know is shown here. If you're growing wheat, the traditional European crop, if you look at the wheat here, it's got this big head and this skinny little stem. So if you're a particularly successful wheat farmer and you have lots and lots of grain on each stem, the plants will fall over because they get top heavy, and this is called lodging, and will kill the plant. And so you're punished, in a certain sense, if you're too successful. Now over here, you have a very happy Lebanese farmer from about 2008, and I don't think that's a photographic trick. I think it is actually, this potato is actually bigger than his head, and it's about a 25-pound potato. And the reason that a potato can be just as big as you want, because it's underground, the architecture of the plant doesn't cause any problems. And so records suggest that Europeans, when the potato comes, grow about 4 times as much dry food matter, as scientists say, taking out the water and all that sort of thing, as from an acre of potatoes that you get from an acre of wheat. And so this huge band of Europe between the Ukraine and Ireland becomes Andeanized. They start growing potatoes, and they get this massive increase in the supply of food. And so up until the early 20th century, you would see these exact same ridges and furrows, but they became increasingly rare because the agricultural reformers and great rationalists became convinced that this was wasteful, and what you needed to do was just grow flat areas of potatoes. And this is something I'm going to bring up later. So you have, I hope, in mind this enormous belt of Europe growing all these potatoes and becoming much more well-fed than ever before. And the effects of this is shown. The great French historian Fernand Braudel was the first to really talk about this, and he compiled both the records and numbers of sort of Europe-wide famines. And what you see is that when the potato comes, these things just drop off the face of the earth because there's just more food available. And then you also see a big kick-up in the number of Europeans. And increasingly, historians recognize that the potato essentially is the fuel for empire. Without before the potato is introduced, European history sort of lurches from one food crisis to the next. There's, in France, for example, in the 17th century, there's one nationwide famine, more than one per decade, and hundreds of local famines. There's bread riots. There's people milling around and starving constantly. There's state granaries that always have armed guards on it. The place is a mess. Potato comes, and pretty much all of this stops. and the population begins to boom. So the governments, because they're not dealing with bread riots, become much more stable, and they have a larger supply of Europeans, so they can go send them off to foreign places to conquer things. And so, it's very difficult to understand these European empires that grow up in the late 18th and 19th century without understanding the potato. And in fact, I would argue if you happen to be going to Books Inc. or one of the fine bookstores in San Francisco and you're in search of a one-volume history of Europe, you should flip through the index, and if you don't see an entry for potato, put the book back and look for a more modern book. Now, the potato also becomes, because it's this new crop, it's growing this new way, it becomes a target for agricultural reformers in the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, people with these names that to a person of my generation sound strange, like Jethro Tull, who turns out to be this important agricultural reformer. I thought it was like something they had made up. And one of the things that they understand in the early 19th century is the role of nitrogen. The plants depend on nitrogen, and if you want to have huge yields, you have to get nitrogen in a particular types of what they call bioavailable forms that the plants can digest. And it turns out that there are these islands off the coast of Peru where seabirds have roosted for millennia upon millennia and have created these huge cliffs, mounds of guano, which turns out to be excellent fertilizer. And so in the middle of the 19th century, they start bringing over Chinese slaves and setting up guano mines and filling ships full of guano and taking them to Europe. And the first big shipments begin in 1843, where the large numbers of ships. And you see, this is the beginning of modern input-intensive agriculture. The kind of thing that there's an entire industry of writers who rail against, many of them here in San Francisco, so I think you know what I'm talking about, this idea of treating the land as a kind of petri dish and so forth. It all begins here with a potato and with guano. And so if you're a modern American farmer in the 19th century, you bought things like this, and you would sprinkle it on, and you'd have these, your soil, and you would have these magical results. Now, these guano ships carried, though, as far as we can determine, a second hidden passenger, Phytophthora infestans, the potato late blight, which is a water mold. Basically, it looks like a fungus, though it's not, from taxonomically a fungus. And basically, it really, really likes to eat potatoes and is very, very good at it. And then you see the first sort of modern agricultural catastrophe. It's first reported here at the end of June 1845, and you can see the ripples spreading out. And basically, over a period of a couple months, it goes all the way across Europe and wipes out the entire potato crop. Now, because potatoes have become so productive, people in Europe are now very, very dependent on the potato. And no one is more dependent on the potato than the Irish. About 40% of the Irish eat literally no solid food other than potatoes. The result is that in a few weeks, the entire food supply for these 40% of the Irish disappear, and it's just a catastrophe beyond imagining. About 2 million people die. 1 million of them alone of them in Ireland, and there's these ships full of half-starved refugees who go across the Atlantic and land in places like Boston and Quebec, leaving a trail of dead behind them. It's just absolutely horrible. This is the last famine that occurred before the widespread use of modern photography, so we don't have any photographic images of it, but English newspapers are full of these kind of drawings. Gives you some idea of what it was like in Ireland. From a biological point of view, what we're learning is that as creatures come over, there's this phenomenon called ecological release, which is they are transported from one place to another. Often the pests and pathogens that like to eat them are not transported along with them. They flourish, they do exceptionally well. This is what happened with the potato, but nature has a way of closing the loop. And in this case, it closed the loop to catastrophic effect. Now, this wasn't just something that happened in Europe. It also, these impacts, if anything, were even larger in China. Now, when I went to Highland Junior High School, we didn't learn anything about China or anything about geography at all. So in case some of you went to my kind of high school, I thought I would show you a map of China. And here it is. And one of the things you'll notice about China here is there's all this parts of China here that there's no river. China has no large bodies of water whatsoever, right? There's no Great Lakes in China. and that there's only these two rivers of any size. The Yangtze and the Huanghe are Yellow River, and most of their course that they go through are these very dry, steep hills, which aren't really suitable for agriculture. So there's only two small areas of China that where there's large amounts of flat, well-watered agricultural land. And this is the sort of central dilemma of Chinese history that has beset emperor after emperor, dynasty after dynasty, that you have 20% of the world's population, 7% of the world's fresh water, and what is the staple food that you really like to grow? It's rice, which has to be grown in swimming pools. And so which is a colossal historical mistake, because if you have a country that's half desert, the last thing you want to do is have rice be your staple crop. Now this all dramatically changes in about 1600 when two American crops come, the sweet potato and maize, or corn as it's called in the States. They're brought over from Manila. They come in actually into the country in a couple of different ways. And they are the first crops that can be grown in relatively dry land, and they're really, really significant agricultural products that produce a lot of calories. And so if you go to northwest or southwest China today in these areas of desert, you see sites like this all over the place. And it's for me, it's totally weird. This looks like they're trying to farm a beach. And yet they managed to get something out of it. And so what you had in China when these crops came in was this massive westward movement as the central government got people into, from the Han Chinese, which is the sort of main Chinese ethnic group, the one that's always, when you refer to the Chinese, you're really referring to the Han Chinese. They go into the lightly settled West, where there's all these ethnic groups that are not Han Chinese. The Han Chinese push them out and start clearing these areas that haven't really been farmed before, and start planting corn and sweet potatoes. And the impact there is much like what happened in Europe. They introduce American crops, boom, China's population goes up, and this is where China really becomes a watchword for population. It's with the Homogenocene. It's creation of this exchange of plants and animals around the world. Now, the way they do this in these very steep areas, again, it goes right into the 20th century. That's why you're able to see photographs like this. It goes right into the Mao dynasty, where they essentially take a village and they say, go out here and terrace this at unimaginable labor. And so there's these huge areas of China where you see this wedding cake effect. And they're growing potatoes, sweet potatoes, and maize, again, American crops. Now, there's a drawback to doing this in these areas, in that there's not that much stone, so all these terraces are made out of dirt. And if you stay in the villages and it rains, which it does occasionally, you're woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning by, and what it is every person out there is going out with hand tools and trying to whack the terraces back into shape because they're falling down all the time. As you can imagine, this isn't the most effective procedure, and so this here is about a 100-year-old terrace where this poor bugger is still trying to grow sweet potatoes. Now, if you're looking at this, I hope you're thinking, well, wait a minute, what happened to all the dirt that used to be there from this terrace? And it goes right down into the bottom of this ravine here. It's picked up in some little creek, nameless creek. It's brought down to a tributary of in this case, the Huanghe, and goes into the Huanghe Yellow River. Now, when you have a whole lot of sediment, eroded sediment going into a river, what happens is, as long as the river is going fast, as long as it's going down through all these steep hills, the churning of the river keeps the sediment suspended. But when it goes into the flat areas, like the North China Plains, the area that I showed with the red circle around it, what happens is, because it's flat, the river slows down. The sediment starts depositing, starts going on the bottom of the riverbed. And because there's a lot of it, you have this curious phenomenon where the riverbed starts to build up. And sooner rather than later, the riverbed starts to get higher than the surrounding land. And so there are parts of China where the Yellow River is 40 feet above the surrounding farmland. Now, you don't have to have a PhD in physics to know it's not an especially good idea to have a giant river 40 feet in the air. The result is, as you will, I think, imagine, floods. And one of the things that we did is when I went to Beijing, we found this book where the Chinese State Meteorological Bureau had compiled all these records from counties, which is the sort of basic, these county gazetteers, which were required every year to fill in and send to the imperial court, and they did these flood maps for 600 years, and they sort of randomly picked one. Now, this is very hard to understand, so what I've done is doctored it up a little bit for you, and the way to think about it, as was explained to me, is that, see these areas here, these dark areas here, this is where, in this sort of randomly chosen year, 1823, they had like a catastrophic Katrina-type flood, where there was, massive amounts of water, massive amounts of deaths, permanent destruction, entire villages wiped out. And then this band here is where they had just sort of deadly floods, where like people's crops would be wiped out or people would be dispossessed, but you didn't have, this appalling, years-long devastation. And this happened year after year after year, fed by the erosion caused by the planting of these American crops. And so the way the State Meteorological Bureau guy explained it to me, he said, just tell your American audiences that it was like a Katrina per month for 100 years. Now, as you can imagine, this didn't endear the Qing dynasty, the government at the time, to the people. You were dealing with millions upon millions of wandering refugees, starvation, massive damage. There is flood refugees caused something called the Taiping Rebellion, where 20 million people died. It was just, China was a total mess. And this, I would argue, goes a long way to explaining why, in the 19th century, after decades of this sort of thing, small groups of Europeans were able to march in and throw their weight around. This has much to do with the fall of China. And so the same kind of ecological swashing around the Homogenocene that was, gave Europe a big leg up, stepped on China for a while. And to this day, the Chinese are still trying to recover from the devastation wrought by these introduction of the American crops. This is the kind of thing that you can do in a dictatorship now. Instead of entire villages being told to go out and terrace, they're told to level the terraces and plant trees. So you see this kind of site, they dig, they're called fish scale pits, they dig them, and now the villagers are rewarded by the number of trees they plant, not by the number of trees they survive, so that you see miles and miles and miles of dead trees, because they grow northern pine, which are not actually terribly suitable. But it was explained to me by one of the villagers that this is actually an okay system, because if the tree is dead, then you don't have to dig a new pit. You just put a new tree in it, it dies the next year, but you've made your quota, and so you're okay. So I'm not really sure about how efficacious this whole bit is, but you can see this. And what this is all, again, is trying to recover from the introduction of the sweet potato and maize 500 years ago. Now, it wasn't the same thing, or similar kinds of effects happened in the Americas. Probably the most long-lasting gift that Columbus gave to the Americas was malaria. Now, in case, again, any of you went to my kind of high school, I should explain that malaria is a single-celled parasite. There's a whole slew of different types, but there's only a few that are important to human beings. All of them are called Plasmodium, and the basic deal is there's a type of mosquito, a genus of mosquitoes called Anopheles that exists, most of the world, that can host these single-celled organisms. They bite you, they inject some of these cells into your body. They go through a bunch of changes, and they get into a form where they can pry open red blood cells and hide inside them, multiply like crazy, and then in a kind of a coordinated assault, they rip open billions of blood cells and flood your body. You feel awful, awful beyond imagining, and while you're racked like this, another mosquito bites you. There's so many of them in your bloodstream, it draws up a few, and the cycle begins anew. And malaria is an incredibly wily organism. Your immune system will eventually, if you survive, beat it off, but it can actually hide in your spleen or your liver for months or even years. And so it became quite possible for Europeans or Africans to cross the Atlantic, come here, and then suddenly get malaria, and there was already vectors, as they call it, they're mosquitoes that are capable of transforming. So it came to the Americas quite early. Now, this is a map showing some of the major types of Anopheles mosquitoes, their ranges, so showing that it was all over the place. Now the deal is the worst kind of malaria is falciparum malaria, Plasmodium falciparum. And the it's a tropical beast, and it really, really hates anything that smacks of cold weather. And so there's a range in which it can exist. And this is roughly it in North America, and it's roughly the Mason-Dixon line, or almost pretty exactly the Mason-Dixon line. Malaria was a constant problem in Washington, D.C., but in southern New Jersey or someplace like that, it was just a rare visitor. Same thing is true here. You have constant problem in southern Brazil, but in Ecuador and Argentina, it's an occasional visitor. And I'd also like you to notice something I would argue is not a coincidence, that this area here is the area in which slavery was a major institution in the Americas. The overlap between the boundaries of malaria and the boundaries of slavery as a major institution, slave societies, is really striking. Now, I'd like you to keep that in your heads for a moment and show you a couple more maps. Now, as you may have learned in school, malaria has been around so long that different types of people in areas with lots of malaria have evolved genetic strategies to try and combat the disease. Most of them involve changing something about the red blood cell to make it harder for the plasmodium to get in and replicate inside. And so here is sickle cell anemia, which is a very complicated thing, but maybe a very simple way of saying it sort of makes you half immune to plasmodium. And as you'll see, it's most concentrated in Central and West Africa. Now, this is another kind that's not nearly as well known, and it's also another way of changing the red blood cell. This one has a couple of bizarre side effects. There's a little bit of it, it's not shown in this map, that's in Sicily, and the result is that there's a certain number of Italian Americans who have this, and one of the side effects of this particular genetic condition is a deadly allergy to fava beans. And so if you live in Italy, every now and then the newspapers will carry a story about some poor guy who goes to see his grandfather's town in Sicily, catches up with Uncle Giorgio, and they're all getting together, they serve him a platter of fava beans and he keels over. But the Italians, of course, is sidelight, and so what you have here, again, Central and West Africa is where people who have this form of immunity exist. There's another type of malaria called vivax malaria that's the second most important. This is a Duffy negative antigen, another red blood cell change. Again, Central and West Africa. In fact, it's so prevalent in Central and West Africa that Central and West Africa are the only tropical places in the entire world where vivax doesn't exist. And finally, as a kind of kicker, malaria is often accompanied by another disease, yellow fever, which is kind of like chicken pox. It's a viral disease. If you get it when you're a kid, you feel sick, but you survive. If you get it as an adult, it's about 75% mortality. It's also transmitted by a mosquito, Aedes aegypti, and at the time of Columbus, the range of Aedes aegypti was here, which meant effectively that all Central and West Africans who got it as children were immune. So this was the greatest pool of people who were immune to yellow fever in the world as well. Now, the difference between being immune to yellow fever and malaria and not being immune was first elucidated by the great historian Philip Curtin. He did epidemiological research, and what he showed, he did studies of British military personnel in various places overseas and recorded simply how many of them died and at what was their death rates. And so if you go to malaria areas like Sierra Leone or the Cape Coast, which is both in West Africa, you see you have roughly between half and 2/3 of all Europeans the Brits who went there, in this time, died, every year. So if you had 100, this is per 1,000, I forgot to say. So if you had 100 Europeans who show up in West Africa, they stay there for a year. At the end of the year, at most 50% will survive. Then he compared it to Africans. These are in the same places, and you see that 32 in the case of West Africa. And so that's like a 10-fold difference. Europeans are 10 times more likely to die in places with malaria and yellow fever than Africans. This has a lot to do, I would argue, with a question that was, I think, first raised by Adam Smith. in The Wealth of Nations. If you read The Wealth of Nations, there's 4 or 5 places in it where he tries to wrestle with slavery, which he couldn't understand why it existed. And the reason he couldn't understand why it existed was, first, there was an institution for getting labor in places in Northern Europe, and it was called the indentured servant. And indentured servants were, in fact, how initially in the early 17th century, most Europeans came to North America. You would sign, you were a tobacco farmer, you would want to have more labor to, people to cut your tobacco. So you would go and find some poor people in England. You would have them sign a contract. You'd pay for their passage, which was very expensive. They would work for you for 4 to 7 years, working off their passage, and then they would then have a chance to start their own farm. And as Smith noted, this system had worked very well in Europe for centuries. Why then was it supplanted by this, plantation slavery, especially given that Africans don't speak the same language as Europeans because they come from tropical areas. They don't farm the same kind of thing. I mean, they don't farm annual crops in the same way, and they certainly don't farm wheat. And then, of course, they have no interest in working because they're slaves. And they want to kill you, if anything. They're like the world's worst workers. So why, Smith said, when you had a perfectly reasonable institution, did this come to existence? And if you read The Wealth of Nations, he basically comes to no answer. He's bringing it up, and then he sort of wrings his hand and says, well, people are evil. And that's the reason. And people may be evil, but it's not very satisfactory. And I would argue that what Adam Smith didn't understand was that the Homogenocene had occurred, and malaria had suddenly transported itself to the Americas, and there's a tenfold more chance that your European indentured servant is going to die than an African slave. And it's better to have an unwilling, rebellious worker than a dead worker. And that this puts a tremendous thumb on the scale and has a powerful explanatory effect about why there is places like Massachusetts, which is the first state to explicitly legalize slavery, but is never really a slave society. And the same thing is true for Argentina, where there's slaves, but it's not a slave society. When just over a few hundred miles away, the same types of people are suddenly involved in full-scale slave societies like you see in Virginia and the Carolinas and Brazil. And this has an impact not only just on our own history, because obviously slavery has a huge impact on American and world history, but it also has an impact on our species itself. Before Columbus, Europeans were basically lived in Europe. Africans were to be found in Africa, Native Americans in Native America, East Asians in Asia, and so forth. There were very few people that were out of place like this. After Columbus, our own species is put in the blender. And you see strange things like European domination in places like Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina. You see African domination in places like Brazil and Chinatowns all over the globe. This tremendous shaking up of our own species. But the dominating factor in this is the African slave trade. And as David Eltis at Emory University points out, that when you think of colonial history, we tend to think of those guys like George Washington, with their wigs and so forth. But in fact, nearly 4 times as many Africans as Europeans came over during this colonial period. And so what you really see from a point of view of biology is, a diminishing native population and this surging African population colliding together throughout the Americas with Europeans playing a demographically peripheral role. And so this is, the view of what actually is happening. And the result is, again, to create this extraordinary mixing of cultures and peoples. And the first one is, and this is a drawing by my daughter, so I hope you're enjoying it. This is in Mexico City, which is the first really 21st century city. It's the first place where you have people from every corner of the world together. There's a big Chinatown in the middle of the Plaza Mayor. This is the picture of the Asian market. There's nearly 10 times as many Africans and people of African descent as there are Europeans. There is, this extraordinary melting pot. And it's the kind of thing that when you walk today in San Francisco, and of course San Francisco is always praised for its extraordinary diversity of cultures, what we're seeing is a kind of replication of something that began in Mexico City 400 years ago, the first truly modern metropolis, and the condition that we are all increasingly heading towards. And again, it's something that's living in the Homogenocene. Who knows what's going to happen next? Thank you very much for coming and listening. Thank you to Stewart. Thank you, Kevin Kevely. Thanks to our friend Neil for bringing us together.
Let's go sit.
Okay.
That was fast. I just felt 500 years go by in a blur. Thank you. So is it over? Is the big mix finished now? It's all, the Homogenocene is one big
No.
milkshake?
Here, I'll give you an example. I
Okay.
talk about actually this in the book. If you want to have an industrial revolution, you need three things. You need fossil fuels, you need steel, and you need rubber. Fossil fuels are pretty much everywhere. Fortunately or unfortunately, they're all over the place. Steel, which is some iron, is all over the place. But the only place we can get natural rubber is of good quality is Brazil, is the Amazon basin. And so in the late 19th century, there was kind of a rubber boom in the Amazon. There's extraordinary phenomena like giant opera houses built in the middle of the forest and this kind of thing. And there's a national villain in Brazil, a British guy named Henry Wickham, the inventor of biopiracy, as they like to call him, who smuggled 70,000 rubber tree seeds out, and now a huge chunk of Southeast Asia is covered in rubber plantations. Because it turns out that even though I learned in Highland Junior High School that synthetic rubber had come up and saved the day in World War II, in fact, synthetic rubber isn't very good. And if you want anything for high-tech purposes or high-intensity purposes, like that you really want to work, like airplane tires or radial tires or anything like that, they're all made out of natural rubber. Natural rubber is 40% of the market. It's still climbing. And so you have an area in Great Britain, an area in Southeast Asia. It's roughly the size of Great Britain that is a single giant rubber plantation. And in Brazil is South American leaf blight, which is to the rubber tree. You make rubber, by the way, out of the tree by you cut it, and there's this sap-like latex that's in it, and you collect it like maple syrup and you boil it down to make natural rubber. Well, there is in South America a blight that is to the rubber tree what potato blight is to the potato. And Americans learned about this when Henry Ford in the 20s bought a huge spread in the lower Amazon, planted entirely in rubber trees, and it was wiped out in months. He lost $1 billion, which in the 30s was real money, I think.
Yeah.
And it was the biggest reverse of his career. So that organism is still there. And now there's highways all throughout Southeast Asia. Now you can drive from Kunming in southern China all the way to Singapore in 3 days. And this is known as the Blight Highway to the botanists who are freaked out about it.
Right.
And I can report from personal experience that even if you show up with Brazilian stamps all over your passport in rubber country, they don't have, how the Food and Agricultural inspectors here will spray your shoes? They don't do any of that. So the botanists have been screaming about this for years and maybe decades, and absolutely nothing is happening. So that's going to happen.
How do you think that plays out? Is this just a blight that takes out the rubber trees?
Well, it's kind of interesting. You lose, the models that I've seen say that you would lose all of it in 3 to 6 months. Because it's like an ocean of breakfast, right? And so it would be the biggest deforestation for a really long time. And so that would have its own effects. But now, Wade Davis, actually, the biologist, was the first to note this.
Spoke here not long ago.
Excellent. We have just-in-time manufacturing. And so it used to be, in the 50s, you would have piles and piles and piles of tires, right?
Right.
Now you don't. Like when you order the tire, they're practically making it there they're practically tapping the tree and making it on the spot. And so the Tire Association told me that there's about a 2-week supply.
So Wade Davis is on this case. He's saying that this is the end of the auto industry some particular year, or what?
He's just saying this is bad. And the extraordinary thing is when he wrote about this, there's a bunch of people who've written about this. He wrote memorably about it. And so I thought, I'm going to write about this, and I'm going to talk about how, because there's this outfit called CURAD, which is the organization of rubber producers. And I'm going to go there, and I'm going to find all these great genetic engineering programs where they're going to breeding these rubber trees. crickets, nothing. And so I wrote to them, and it's amazing. But
So-
when you think about it, though,
Okay.
I should not have been surprised. I doubt that there's that many people in this audience who can be shocked to find out that a government-sponsored organization isn't all that responsive.
Well, okay, Ireland, if they just brought over a few more varieties of potato, it would
That would have been helpful.
Yeah. So are there not a lot of varieties of rubber tree? Is this?
These are all actually, I mean, it's like a joke, but Henry Wickham brings over 70,000. He doesn't, and they're not properly stored. They're not. He's paid by the weight, so he just grabs them all up, whether they're rotten or not. And he brings, because he's paid by the seed, and so they're imagining, when the British Kew Gardens, charges him with this, that he's going to come over with half a dozen of these lovingly. He said he brings 3/4 of a ton, and they have about a 1% germination rate, and which even for an amateur gardener is bad.
Yes.
And then they take them in boats to Sri Lanka, and there most of them die. And so it's very hard to find the exact number, but we'll say 6 that survive. And all the rubber trees in Southeast Asia, not all, but probably, I haven't actually checked all of them, but it is thought that a very, very, very large percentage of the rubber trees in Southeast Asia are from those 6.
So back in the
They're like
Amazon,
clones.
there's presumably a bit of variety, and the trees have a workaround.
Oh yeah,
in terms of
and in fact,
biodiversity.
if you read another Wade Davis book, One River, which is a great book, he's a really good writer. So
He's Irish, you can't help it.
the U.S. government was very upset when the Japanese, took over in World War II the rubber country. So in addition to developing the synthetic rubber, they sent a guy named Schultes, who is the great botanist from Harvard, tropical botanist, founder of ethnobotany, just a brilliant guy.
Interested in drugs.
And he goes, but he's a patriotic druggie, and he goes up and down the Amazon, and he collects hundreds and hundreds of different rubber trees, and they plant them in 2 plantations, I think Panama and Costa Rica, I don't remember the details, and they find some that they think are resistant. And then the war ends, and the U.S. government destroys the plantations because it's a government.
Okay.
So this is going to happen. I mean, it seems, well, anyway, it's highly unlikely that it's not.
Yeah, okay, heard it here first.
Yeah.
A couple of kind of technical questions. One from Jim Spalding. Why didn't the Chinese flood create big fertile plains in those rivers?
Well,
I mean,
they did.
They get 40 feet high and then they flow out over the
did,
land. Doesn't that become fertile land now?
Well, yeah, but there's several 100,000 Chinese buried under it, and and so.
There's a lot more Chinese who could come in and plant that land now, or what?
Well,
happens?
yeah. I mean, it's in some sort of horrible net way, it's good for the land. But if you're a friend and relative, it's probably difficult for you to take that kind of long-term perspective.
So it does happen.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's the same thing as in our Mississippi Valley. I mean, the Katrina was on some level probably a net ecological plus. But this is not a viewpoint that is particularly popular in New Orleans.
That's interesting. I would like to see an article on that.
I don't think I'd want to be the one to write it, though.
Yeah, well, you get in trouble, too.
Today, it's very easy to find people.
Austin asked a question. This is primarily land-based homogenization you're talking about. What's going on with the oceans?
Well, the big story of the oceans, I mean, you guys in San Francisco know all about it. It's ship ballast, right? And here's a case where there actually has been some successful action, because what starts with, actually, probably the first thing we really understand something about is in Chesapeake Bay. And they wipe out the tidal areas there and start growing tobacco like crazy. And tobacco is very heavy. So you got to bring pretty big boats to carry it. I mean, the barrel of tobacco, it's because it's wet.
I never thought of that.
Weighs about a ton. And they bring in these barrels, and so the ships come back, and I mean, over there, and they whatever they're bringing is very light compared to, so they have lots and lots of ballast. The ballast is made by taking good English dirt and throwing it in the bottom of the ship.
Right.
And in fact, I found an 18th century ballast manual that tells you where to find good dirt and stuff like this. Now, it turns out that almost all of northern North America has no native earthworms. And the reason for this is they were squished by the Ice Age. Then for an area south, by the glaciers and so forth, and then for an area south, there was permafrost, and the earthworms don't like permafrost. And earthworms don't have a lot of get up and go. And so the earthworm specialists I talked to told me that, earthworms, if you had a 10 by 10 area or a 15 by 15 area, an earthworm would spend its entire life there. So they move north, but really, really slowly.
Okay.
And so there's effectively none in northern parts of North America. And so over thousands of years, in fact, the ecosystems in places like Minnesota and Massachusetts, where I live, develop in their absence. And earthworms are like these tiny amazing engineers. And so when Europeans come, the ballast, they bring it, and then they're transporting plants, they're carrying their own dirt, and pretty soon there's earthworms all over the place. And so we're having this sort of slow experiment of what happens when an area has evolved without earthworms for thousands of years, and it's carried across in ship ballast. Now the same thing is happening in San Francisco within the waters, right?
Okay.
Where people because after they start getting upset about the the dirt being all over the place, they start using ballast as water, and they scoop up water in China and they bring it over here, and vice versa. And the result is that I think the figure is almost 3/4 of the species in San Francisco Bay are non-native. So we have these sort of novel ecosystems.
It's supposedly the most biologically invaded body of water there is.
Right, it's a total novel ecosystem. I mean, you guys are once ahead leading the world.
But
us pikers on the East Coast can only marvel at your modernity.
A couple of weeks ago, we were out. I live on a tugboat, and we took it out to Golden Gate to celebrate New Year's a couple of months ago. And there are harbor porpoises out there. They've been identified, and they all have names, and they're up to 400. These guys have been gone for 40 years. Maybe because of agricultural runoff or who knows what. But they're back, which suggests a really healthy ecosystem in the water out there. Because when you get those top predators, they've got to feed on a whole bunch of stuff that's coming up the food chain. So those 3/4 of alien invaders have not made the bay unhealthy, as near as I can tell.
It's sort of unfortunate we have this various invaders because the great majority of them are perfectly benign, and the ones that are problematic are not problematic because they're immigrants, but they're problematic because they're problematic. We have native species that are, pains in the neck, and so we have this idea of these pristine ecosystems, and the great geographer William Denevan calls this the pristine myth, that we have this idea of these ecosystems as these untouched, permanent entities that go through these beautiful stages of succession and are whole and self-contained, and it really doesn't work like that. What's happened is that this kind of natural mixing we've sort of turned it up to 11. Spinal Tap reference, right? And there's reason to wish that maybe we'd turn it back down to like 8,
8.5.
8.5, yeah.
Well, you can imagine it's going to be tough to get and eradicate the earthworm.
Maybe not even desirable, but there are things that you could do.
The robins alone are going to complain. The people who like the robins.
Right, but it's like sugar maples are disappearing from former sugar maple forests because when they're little, the sugar maple saplings have these roots that, because when you don't have earthworms, what they do is there's leaf litter, the leaves fall down in the soil.
Right.
And basically earthworms are machines that eat all that stuff and go down into the soil and excrete it in the form of worm castings.
Enrich the soil.
Enrich the soil.
Right.
But if you're in a worm-free area, all the plants have these little root-like threads that go into the pile of leaf litter above the soil, and especially littler plants. And so when the worms go, they're incredibly efficient. They can wipe out this leaf litter in a matter of months, and then all these plants don't, a plant can't say, oh, I guess the food is down here now. It just futilely tries to feed itself where it's going to. And so you're seeing a wholesale replacement of certain types of vegetation.
So we've got to engineer some maple trees to make sugar bushes that know about the food that being down there and stuff up on top.
Or the other approach is there's the various bands of kind of admirable people who are trying to fight the worm invasion. There's the Minnesota Worm Watch.
By pulling them up and feeding them to fish?
Well, they put up signs like, fishermen, please, don't, in addition to taking out your trash, take out your worms. And Alberta has a program to teach, elementary school kids about the evils of worms. And I'm not kidding.
Just goes to show. Can you talk more about this? Looks like Candace. Can you talk more about the European Ice Age and its causation? There's a paleoclimatologist named Rudiman.
Yes, Rudiman, who's the first guy to point this out.
And is he? It seemed like it was kind of controversial when he said,
"Well,
wow,
he has two
change in a big way."
He has two separate parts of his his theory, and he wrote a book. I think it's called "Plows, Plagues, and Petroleum."
You got it.
Right.
That's good.
And it's also quite interesting, and it's not long, so that's good. And he argues that that this, in effect, it came out before my book, but he effectively argues that this man guy is all wet, that the Homogenocene and the Anthropocene, all these things really began with the invention of agriculture. And we have been having a dramatic impact on the climate since agriculture, which involves, clearing huge forests and so forth, and actually literally changing the albedo of the planet. But there's these dips in the past, actually, it's sort of worked out, as I understand it, that the increasing temperature rise has more or less canceled out what would have been a natural cooling trend. And this is why climatologists were confused and wrote in the 60s and 70s that we should be heading for an ice age, because normally we would be, but we've been lately our balance has gotten off. And we're no longer just canceling the natural effect, but we're going off into all kinds of effects that are far beyond the scope.
But the great news is no more ice ages.
Right. So anyway, the climate change thing, the little ice age. So there's an argument about whether agriculture really had that much effect. The particular thing I'm talking about is the little ice age, and there's three main theories for why the little ice age was caused. One is sunspots. And there's this period of time called the Maunder minimum. And basically, I don't think anybody believes that anymore. There's a couple papers that sort of trash that. And the second one is that there is these volcanoes, and that there is this 250-year run of volcanoes. And that could happen because, the volcanoes put stuff in the air.
They've done it before.
It's done it before, like Krakatoa set off the year without the summer and that sort of stuff in 1815. But you'd have to have 250 years of volcanoes, and there just doesn't seem to be records of enough volcanoes. And so this theory has hit the skids a bit, although it was recently somebody tried to resurrect it by saying that, well, it seemed to me kind of like hand-waving, that they sort of said, well, maybe there's these other effects that would make it last longer. And so this is the main theory that's left standing. I'm sure the authors of the paper wouldn't like to hear it described that way.
Question from somebody nameless. Why didn't the Africans die of the Eurasian diseases the way the Native Americans did? Well, they were all the Europeans came over. They've been living with all these animals. They came over. They had all these diseases, and they were also colonizing in Africa. Right. Were Africans dying from those European diseases?
To a small extent, but basically most of those diseases existed in Africa because all those areas are connected. And so you had smallpox and TB and all those kind of diseases existed in most of Africa. The big change is across the Pacific and across the Atlantic.
Okay. John Willis asks, what is your take on the native plant movement, which I'm a member of. I rip up all kinds of alien invasive plants that I don't like.
I guess I like them. I think it's,
the people or the plants?
The plants. I think it's neat that, we're well, I guess my attitude is inconsistent, like pretty much everybody else's. We have, we're building a house, and so we're landscaping it right now, and we want to landscape it in New England plants because that's sort of cool. And there's something about a sense of place and so forth. But in fact, we also are planting cherry trees because I like cherry trees, and cherry trees have nothing to do with New England, right? And peach trees are also invasive. Actually, their peach trees, when they were introduced to Georgia, were so invasive that it was called a wilderness of peach trees, and people were trying to cut them down, and they were being choked out. It was kind of it was a precursor to kudzu.
What do peach trees replace, I wonder? We don't know. They're all gone.
They're all gone. Well, there were these empty areas that that native people had cultivated, and you have the peach trees rushing in to a head of
they're a
local.
succession plant.
They're a succession plant. Yeah.
Well.
And the cool one was Darwin writes about this, and he saw huge forests of artichoke in Argentina that were making the pampas, impossible to pass through, and people were, cursing the artichokes. And then there were reports of gigantic fields of arugula in Peru.
There are arugula enthusiasts like my wife who would probably like to go to such a region and just
But I think they're beating it away with a stick. Right?
Alex asks, how homogeneous do you think the Earth can really get in, say, the next 500 years?
Pretty homogeneous.
Okay.
But, there's obviously going to be
are
limits.
we mostly done or halfway along, or what would you say?
It's sort of hard to say. We don't even know how many species there are, right?
Oh, you bet.
You've probably heard, I'm sure Ed Wilson talked about the enormous ignorance. So
we know of maybe 1.3 million species of this and that,
and he
not
thinks
including the
there's
microbes.
Millions upon millions more.
Right.
So what percentage of those species?
Most of those endemic guys in little islands and stuff.
But
still.
a lot of them can move around.
Right.
Kudzu was endemic to Japan. And now, if you've been to the southeast, it's definitely not endemic to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be
So more kudzus to come, do you think?
I think there's going to be more. I mean, what are the odds that, given that we don't even have a clue as to how many species there are, that all of them from everywhere have gotten to where their final destination? It just seems very unlikely to me.
So, somewhat overlapping with this is, do you mind talking to this audience a little bit about the book you're working on now?
Sure, I guess. I don't really have.
It's always very tricky, but
I'm
I think
happy
it's
to do
less tricky with nonfiction than with fiction.
Yeah.
If this was a novel you were working on, I would not ask you to talk about it.
The real problem for me is that I don't really have an elevator speech.
That's right. Just hold forth. What's it about?
Hold forth. My heart sinks as imagining these people hearing the words
You
hold
mentioned
forth and
two
making
people
it
to
out
me.
of
Start
the
with the
X's.
two people. What are the two people?
So anyway, it's a book about the future that makes no predictions. Okay, without predictions.
We like that.
Yeah.
This is a book that stays in print.
Yeah. To begin with, all those books about the future that make predictions, the predictions are wrong. They're always wrong, and then the author looks like an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at the same time, the idea is that I have some kids, and I was looking at them and thinking, when they're my age, there's going to be between 9 and 10 billion people in the world.
That's interesting.
Which is a lot, right? And when you talk to people like agronomists and water specialists like Peter Gleich and those guys, they're very worried about how we're all going to manage this. And it's a severe technical challenge, because not only are there all these people, actually the number of people is less important than the fact that one of the big changes in our lifetime has been that huge numbers of people in Asia and Latin America have been lifted out of really dire poverty. When I went to Highland Junior High School, about 40% of the world was hungry or not quite getting adequate nutrition or much worse, and now it's about 7%. I mean, that's like an incredible thing, right?
Yeah.
We live in a time where this
So
it's
that's
a miracle.
Huge demographic event. You think it's a huge ecological event?
Well, yeah, because when you're wealthier, you want to eat better. You don't want your parents' gruel. If you're really at the edge, you'll eat gruel, but you'd like a Snickers bar. You'd like an occasional treat. You'd like a burger. Of course you would. I would. You would. And so, what this translates is that people who spend a lot of time thinking about this argue that, roughly speaking, by 2050, we're going to need to come up with 40% more cereal crops, 40% more grain.
40% more grain by 2050.
Yeah,
Okay.
which is a lot, right? Because it's not exactly.
And then
like
it
there's
levels
huge
off because population's leveling
and populations
off?
level off, and all this is kind of squishy. But the idea, it's still a lot, and it makes sort of intuitive sense. So how are you going to do this? And there's two main approaches which are associated with these two guys, and at least in my mind. And they're the two. I told you this was like not.
Start with Vogue.
Okay. Well, there's these two guy said, I think are the most important people in the 20th century for the 21st century, if you follow.
Cool.
And they articulate...
They were pretty important in the 20th century.
Yeah, but they were really important for the next century, I think,
Okay.
because they embody the two, sort of broadly speaking, the two main approaches. And one guy, and neither of them anybody's heard of, which is like good and bad, right? Because it's
You
not exactly...
specialize that in your books. You're full of news for people. I didn't know all the slavery stuff and these other things.
I like that. I'm going to have to tell my publisher, this is not a book about two people nobody's ever heard of, but it's full of news.
Good.
You heard that, right?
He really does it. This is
right. Anyway,
kind of book.
so there's this one guy who's the first guy who wrote a sort of modern "We're all going to hell" book. His name was William Vogt. Look at the dead silence, right? Has anybody in this room heard of him? William Vogt, V-O-G-T.
And then he inspired the Our Plundered Planet guy.
Yeah, the Our Plundered Planet guy. And
Who was he?
I knew you were going to say. I can't remember at the moment.
Okay,
I'm having a mental lapse.
And
but
then
anyway,
both of them inspired Paul Ehrlich, who we
yeah,
have heard of.
Paul Ehrlich, but you know,
He spoke on the stage not long ago.
Was the guy who put into print Aldo Leopold. He basically wrote Aldo Leopold stuff because Leopold was a brilliant guy, but not really that much of a writer. The Sand County Almanac, which was put together after his death.
By Vogt?
By Vogt.
Wow.
He got Rachel Carson into print. He inspired the population bomb. He was the director of the Population Council. He was the major force and founder of zero population growth. There's this guy named Hugh Moore who he basically dragged in and became the funder of all these things. And Vogt was so he did all these things. But he was the first guy in a book called The Road to Survival, which was published in the 40s, to do the modern version of Malthusianism, which is Malthus said that basically we grow more food. We have more babies, the babies eat the food, we go back to the same level of misery.
Right.
Vogt said, no, we're going to grow enough food, but in doing so, we're going to trash the ecosystems on which we depend. It's a very different approach, that in feeding us, in supplying our demands, we're going to wreck stuff. And so he was the first person to say, we need to cut back. The Al Gore approach, the Jimmy Carter wear a cardigan sweater approach. Turn down the thermostat, reduce the human footprint, don't eat meat.
This is late 40s after the war. He's saying, let's cut back?
Yeah.
Oh, good luck with that.
Well, actually, there's a lot of people
here
who
comes
listen.
The 50s. I mean, everybody is.
Yeah, but no, actually, a lot of people listen because.
That's true. My mother listened.
Yeah.
I've got these
Your mother was not
around the
alone.
house.
No, it was very, and it was very much, he was also very important in the Audubon Society. He was one of the founders of the breeding bird census. The guy was all over the place. Really a remarkable guy. And his human interest, he did all this while having polio. And so he, went all over the world on a wheelchair. And so he's, a gutsy guy. And
That's great.
He hated the other guy, as far as we can tell, and whose name was Norman Borlaug. I bet you some of you have heard his name, yeah.
Yeah.
And Borlaug, in addition to being the guy who started the Green Revolution, was kind of the apotheosis of the idea and that we have these environmental problems. We have, they're serious, but using science and technology, we can produce our way out of them. And the Green Revolution is the case, but he was also a major force in nuclear power. He was a big backer of genetic engineering.
Just I did not know. Borlaug actually was a force for nuclear power?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, he was a major, what he did was he knew these people, when you see him constantly, pushing nuclear power in environmental organizations saying, don't fight nuclear power, don't fight nuclear power. This would be of interest to you, I would imagine, yeah.
I didn't know that.
And
they didn't listen to him.
No, didn't listen to him. His World Food Address, talks about the need for clean, safe sources of energy. So he uses his weight. And is also a major backer of genetic engineering. One of his last projects is this project that we were talking about before, to attempt to to change the way photosynthesis works in rice, to make it more productive.
Say a little more about this. And what's
it's an
the
amazing project done by this outfit called the International Rice Research Institute outside of Manila. An incredible place, and it's the place that really brought the Green Revolution to rice. And there's an international collaboration that started in 2009, the year of Borlaug's death.
By the way, bearing in mind that half of all humanity eats rice as
Right.
its staple.
And there's 4 different types of photosynthesis. I believe that's the number still. And there's a lot of argument about how they differently evolve. And the basic thing is that they're all horribly inefficient. There's like the worst most inefficient chemical reaction you can imagine. You know, as a friend of mine said, it's like proof of the existence of God, because no real human would have come up with something so bad. It sort of makes sense, right?
Stupid design, we call it.
Yeah, stupid design. Anyway, there's some of it, however, is less inefficient, and that's called C4, and that's one of the reasons that corn is so incredibly productive and grows these huge stalks, is it has a slightly more efficient version of photosynthesis than rice
Is
and wheat.
sugar cane C4?
Yes.
Okay,
And
there
it
you
grows
go.
like crazy, right? And so I think it is, yeah. And does anybody know?
We
Somebody-
think sugar cane is C4.
Are
Correct
you
us
right?
if we're wrong.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Oh, good.
Okay.
I suddenly thought, you know, there's people in the audience who will know this,
Yeah,
in this kind of crowd, right? So I can't just get away with a blather that I, yeah. Thank you. Have I said anything else wrong?
There's a certain amount of where do we start, but that's okay.
Anyway, the idea is that you can transplant this mechanism that, into rice, and it won't alter, in theory, the flavor of the rice or the way rice. What it will do is make it grow faster, and you might get another crop in there. And you could put soybeans or something in there that would replenish the soil, and you could boost agricultural productivity.
Yeah, this is fundamental stuff. We're talking about changing the nature of the
Yeah,
metabolism of this
it doesn't
plant.
get much more fundamental than that.
Yeah.
And so this whole thing, like the flavor saver tomato, and all these other things, it just seems like, yeah.
We're going deep. Well, what's the current read? He was working on C4 rice. Does it look likely or what?
I've just begun research on this, but so all I can tell you is that the researchers feel very optimistic.
So Norman Borlaug and Vogt worked
And so
together
the idea-
often, did they?
No, they didn't. The basic idea is that for the book is to take 4 real serious areas, which rather cheesily I think of as the 4 elements. Earth, air, fire, and water. And so earth is
God,
agriculture.
that's lazy.
Yeah, it is horrible. I may not do it because, I'm going to cover those 4 areas, but it's pretty bad. But it worked as a sales thing. And look, this is the only part of the elevator pitch that I had. And he just trashed it.
Yeah. Leave out the 4 Greek elements.
Yeah, well, maybe, okay, you heard it here, guys. It's gone, okay? But anyway, the idea is that there's agriculture, how we're going to feed all these people. There's water. And there's a high-tech, version of that, which is these massive desalination plants, which
Run
are
by nuclear power.
run by nuclear power, which you're seeing in places like northeast China. And then there's, energy supplies, and then climate change, which is sort of odd man out, but it also plays a role in all this. The idea is that there's a Borlaugian path, like in water's case. That would be it. And curiously enough, China is trying to embrace both with water, because in Tianjin, which is this huge city, they're rewiring the whole city, replumbing the whole city to have gray water in every apartment, which is costing $11 billion. And
Holy smokes.
and so, and of course, the deal is that as China is discovering, you really can't do both. They're both of these approaches, the Borlaugian and Votian approach are in fact
Well, here in
expensive and
California,
complicated.
you may know that we feed drinking water to our agriculture.
Right. Excellent.
Which, at vast expense
Yeah.
in energy and everything else. And I think there's a good argument for letting the gray water or less
Right.
incredibly pristine water, Perrier basically going out in the acres and acres of
Yeah. I have to say that
acres.
when I was in my first time I came to real visit to California, and I'm driving along the Central Valley, and I'm seeing these swimming pools in 106 degree heat, and I'm driving with my friend Peter Menzel, the photographer, and I said, "What's that?" And he says, "Rice," and I just like, no, they're growing rice in the desert. Get real,
Turned out to be good for the birds, actually, because they figured out a way. The Cadillac Ranch guy figured out that actually the dry part of the season, and bring the birds in, they poop.
Yeah.
Instant guano that you don't pay for. A lot of advantages, actually, to some of especially in Northern California.
Oh, sure. No, I mean,
rice agriculture.
Still,
the flyways
106
and the rice
degrees.
guys work together.
Yeah, 106 degrees, vast amounts of really good water. Oof.
Yeah, there's that. So China is gray watering a city.
And you can't really do, it turns out that as a practical matter, it's very hard to do both because the people in the gray water say, wait a minute, you're charging me to like redo all this stuff in my apartment, and over there they have fresh water from salinization, and the people who are doing the salinization say, wait a minute, why are they doing the gray water? You know, that money should go to us. Both of them are saying that money should go to us. And so I would argue, in most places, as a practical matter, you're going to tend towards one part of the spectrum or the other, and that, you know, my children, your children, are going to, you know, ultimately that's going to be the decision that they're going to make.
Do you have a name for these two paradigms yet?
Well, I call them, I'm afraid to tell you because you're going to say it's terrible, and then I don't have a backup.
Listen, I'm so in awe of your books that you pay no attention.
This is like the soft soap. I mean, it's so naked. It's
you know, when I admire something, I can't help it. I just blurt it out. You know?
Oh, man.
So anyway, the two paradigms, have they...
So I you know, obviously Votian and Borlagian, which is terrible, but
That's all right.
I've sort of, the title of the book tentatively is The Wizard and the Prophet.
The Wizard and the Prophet, what do you say?
This is, I can take this little part and send it to my editor.
Got a subtitle?
Yeah, no.
Okay. It's actually pretty good, because I can even tell who is who.
Yeah.
So, play out a Votian version of this century. I think I have a pretty good idea of what Borlaug would want to do, mainly because it's sort of what I would want to do.
Yeah.
But I used to be over in the Votian view of things because my teacher, Paul Ehrlich, and various other things that I bought from my fellow environmentalists incorrectly. And so I could see the Borlaugian thing coming along, more and more engineers in the world, blah, blah, blah. The developing world developing, among other things, a lot of really smart people with really good training who have their own agricultural issues, water issues, and so on, and they're not running their engineering ideas through us anymore. They're doing them right there where they live, and they don't necessarily worry about things that we worry about.
So we'll talk, I guess I think of it, I mean, again, this is something I'm researching, but I think that you can think of it as weak vote and strong vote. Weak vote is kind of like we all stop eating meat, you know, and then
pull out your canines when you do
it. Pull out your canines, and then, you know, and there's, in fact, there was just an op-ed in the New York Times last week, I think, a big deal, you know, where someone said that essentially meat is just unsustainable in any way.
That's true. On the other hand, so vote would say stop eating meat.
That's the weak version. Now the other,
and Borlaug would say grow meat in vats.
Grow meat in vats. But you know, the curious thing is that.
And so does PETA, by the way.
Yeah, PETA says that. Yeah, no, I actually went over there to the Netherlands, which is the center of that, a couple of months ago, and you know, this is a project that could clearly happen. It's because it's tissue. So the weird thing is that they just can't get funding. This is like a Kickstarter project.
Oh, Christ.
That's all they said, is they just can't get funding. And they're, you know, this is not... But the other approach is that you sort of rethink agriculture itself, and that cereal agriculture, grain agriculture is, you know, it's not suitable for every place. There's a lot of places where we do it where it's not, you know, especially, you know, the smartest way to go about it. And there are other models of agriculture.
Agroforestry and all these things.
Trees and tubers. And
trees and tubers.
Trees and tubers. And there's a lot of research on this, and it's just stupefyingly productive. The question is whether you could really mechanize it. And you know, there's a lot of issues with that. I tend to think engineers are smart.
Cleverer and cleverer.
Yeah, engineers
They're
are
going
smart.
to sniff truffles pretty soon.
You're right. If you can sniff a truffle, you can probably pick a tree. And there you get, you know, because what you have is these systems tend to replicate natural systems. You have some advantages, and you're doing kind of multi-cropping at once. And that
robots
kind of,
with serapes and big hats.
And that you know, so there's in a weird way, you know, again, that's something that, but there's a fair number of people, very smart people in places like Brazil, who think that this is the, you know, this is the way to go, and that you could have extraordinarily productive farms without going through this very complicated procedure that they're doing in Erie, which is they regard, in the sort of Votian way, as trying to, wring the last drops out of an exhausted paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Where's population growth fit in all of this?
It says, as far as I can tell, this is a time when there's a little bit of neo-Malthusianism in the air. You have things like there's been reports of forced sterilization coming up again.
Where?
In India.
But of who by who?
I don't really, there's an article in The Guardian about it a couple of weeks ago. So, and there's a woman named Betsy Hartman at Hampshire College, who's really the expert on this, and basically what I know is from her, just says that, this is like, she said, I thought we had got rid of this in the 70s.
No kidding, yeah.
And it's back. And she believes that, I'm really just taking it from her, so I haven't really independently verified to this, but she believes that, in the NGO world, it's all back. Not in the, it's coming back. It's coming back. And her argument.
The book that's really good on that, by the way, is Fred Pierce's The Coming Population Collapse,
right,
called People Quake.
No, it is complicated because all societies have depended on this population structure. We have lots and lots of young people and a small number of older people, and that's kind of how the Social Security and all that is. The assumption is that there's all these younger people who are kicking in their pennies to support a small number of older people, but people like you and me are hanging around for far too long, and we're not having enough babies, and so the result, instead of being a triangle, pyramid as it's called, is looking more like this. No society ever has looked like this before. So that is a genuine change. And you have, if they live, if people like you and me don't kick the bucket enough, we end up with things like, these endlessly hanging around people like, can you imagine Donald Trump at 160 years old?
How about Edward O. Wilson at 160? I would settle for that.
Well, I know, but the question is, the Edward O. Wilson at 160 cancel through Donald Trump when his fortune is multiplied through the magic of compound interest?
Now, a number of this audience heard Ed Wilson Friday night, and I think you read his book on your way here or not? And so this group would probably be interested to know what you make of Ed Wilson and the social conquest of Earth.
Well, Ed and I have a complicated relationship.
Aha!
I mean, not an important one to him in any way, but I wrote when he started coming out with the biodiversity stuff, I wrote an article in Science about, because I'm a correspondent for Science, about that the math and the science behind the biodiversity crisis was very shaky, which it is.
Hot spots have sort of gone away.
Well, they're just, it's all based on, there's a guy named Peters in the 90s who wrote a thing called A Critique for Ecology, which he lambasted ecologists for not really being rigorous. And unfortunately, it's still quite true. And then, I don't know, then I wrote a review of consilience, which I argued that he starts from as he did with sociobiology, he starts from this incredibly solid base in the insect kingdom, but he's a little bit like he's inching along a branch until he gets to the very end, at which point he saws off the branch and falls to the ground with a large crash. And so, he is essentially saying the entire world is like social insects. And and making by analogy,
You think you did like that again with this book?
A bit.
You social people are like you social ants, only not?
Yeah, and it's like an analogy, which is a really powerful analogy, but I don't know if it's actually science.
Do you buy group selection, multi-level selection?
I don't know. I just read the book, and so I'd have to read it again. But I looked in there. I thought, well, that's really interesting. But I don't think I couldn't find where he specified the exact mechanism by which it would happen. He said it seemed to me he was saying, but maybe I'm wrong, okay? Because as I said, I read it on a plane, which is not really conducive to thought. I kept thinking, well, how does this happen exactly? I'm like I don't have much imagination. I always want to know, well, wait a minute, where is he saying it happens? How? And it seemed to me, but I could be wrong, that he was sort of saying, well, it happens because look, it must have happened. But I have to say, no, how? You know, it's not enough to say it must have. You want to say how.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Gaia hypothesis, where basically James Lovelock was saying, well, you know, we're not like Mars and we're not like Venus, so the end result suggests that where you have life, you have a self-regulating
Yeah, no, I wrote a
atmosphere.
piece about that for Science, sort of saying that, but how exactly? How?
Hydrogen sulfide looked pretty good as the
Yeah.
thing that was coming out of the
So-
microorganisms in the ocean and
so, you know,
making
maybe-
droplets which make clouds. Which
Yeah,
then,
yeah. Maybe the way to put it is that this is not a book for the very literal-minded like me.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So this conversation will continue. So
He's an incredibly nice man, I have to say. I feel uncomfortable in this because he's just an extraordinarily decent guy.
and he's been terrifyingly right a lot of times.
Oh yeah, so we're picking on the, you know, it's unfair. And as a natural scientist, he's without peer as for the ants stuff.
Your book, the new one, The Wizard and the Prophet,
The unwritten and unresearched book, yeah.
is talking about the whole century or 2050 like everybody does, or what's the time frame?
Well, I'm a little bit vague about that because it's unwritten and unresearched, but I think that the point is it's probably this coming century. It's that it's, you know, I mean, you know, to attempt to imagine what things are going to be like in 100 years seems, you know, at the very edge of possibility. But you could probably get 30 years, you know.
Well, the kinds of biological changes that you did research and did write very well about in these two books, 1491 and 1493, what was the pace of change of those events?
Some fast, some slow.
Say a little bit about each and why.
Well, I mean, a big example would be the smallpox. You know, smallpox came in, and that was a very fast killer. And is it kind of like it comes in apparently in 1519, comes to the American mainland. There's some records that it was brought in by an African slave named Francisco Eguia. Historian I talked to thinks that this is Spanish malarkey and that they just don't want to cop to the fact that they brought it themselves, so they blame it on an African. And so this is all quite clear in the records. And there's an interesting thing actually demonstrating the importance of disease to the European conquest of the Americas. You know, Cortez comes before this,
Right.
and he does this thing that the Spaniards have learned in the islands, which is you seize the king. And this would have worked in Europe, by the way, if a party of Inca had somehow come to France and seized the Sun King, and you know, the court would have been paralyzed for months. In the same way, the same thing would have happened in Stalin, right? And so they.
This is a novel I want somebody to write?
Yeah, but it would have worked.
Alternative history?
Yeah, it would have worked. It would have worked, and it worked in you know, because
The Chinese guys in those big ships could have done it.
yeah, Chinese guys in the British ships could have done it exactly, and they seized
That
the
was
king.
the previous speaker of Why the West Rules for Now. Who was
Right,
here.
or Morris, and a really interesting book. Yeah. So they seize the king, and it does as it would have done in most places in the world. It paralyzes the court for a few months, and then they sort of regroup. They say, "Wait a minute. There's just a few hundred of these guys, and there's like umpteen billion of us. Even though the king is divinely, you know, appointed, okay,
Do the math. Right?
yeah, do the math." And so they attack the Spaniards, and they kick Cortez's ass. That's a technical term I'm using here. And they
Hard
kill.
to do with guys with, you know, guns and swords and steel and
Yeah, but
horses and stuff.
They kill all the horses. They wipe out, I think it's about 2/3 of the Spaniards. And supposedly, in Spanish histories, it's called the Noche Triste. It's the sad night. It's a great night if you're not Spanish. But supposedly, Cortez, you know, he escapes and sits under some tree, and cries at the ruination of his hopes. So then.
Did he still have the girlfriend that had helped him get
Marina,
into
yeah, she got away. Yeah, she got away. And so
This is a really good story.
yeah, and weirdly enough, there's really no good account of it that takes together, because these were literate societies, and there's tons of native sources about it written, you know, in the language, but there's nothing that's really tries to combine the two of them. The closest is an academic study, quite a good one, by a guy named Hasek. But there's nothing that's really meant for ordinary people. Anyway, so he cries, and then he is an amazing guy, Cortez. He starts all over again, and basically what he's done is foment a civil war. Everybody hates the Aztecs, so he he manages to gin up this he's a tremendous politician. He gins up this coalition. So he's riding at the head of an army of tens of thousands of people.
Local people.
Local people, right. What he's doing, in this very clever way, he foments a civil war and hijacks it to put themselves in charge. Both sides exhaust themselves. But what happens is, he's lost. While he's gathering together the second time, the smallpox comes in, and untreated smallpox kills about 40% of the people who get it. So this is one of the most densely populated parts of the earth. And 40% of the people die, including most of the court in Tenochtitlan. And the Spaniards are all immune. And so they draw from this, their immunity, pretty clearly, well, God must like us, right? And the Indians draw the same lesson, because they see the Spaniards are immune. Right. They think God must not like us. It's a tremendous psychological boost, and they're able to take it in the wiped out court and goes to victory. So you have an experiment there. Yeah. Anyway,
I was on a panel with Joseph Nye, the other guy, the other day, the guy who does soft power.
Right.
And he says narrative is everything, and sequence drives narrative. And this was a case where, this biological event occurred, and then you had these two mirror narratives that came up at the same time, and then that made the human event happen.
Yeah, in the 60s, they traced this epidemic, and it raced all the way through Central America. And again, there's records of it when Spaniards would come and they'd find all these people who'd had smallpox and say, how long ago was it? It was 10 years ago, and and went into the Inca Empire, which is again this hugely populous central society, and it killed the emperor, killed a bunch of his chosen successor, killed a bunch of the people in the court, and led to a civil war, over the succession that Pizarro was able to walk into and hijack.
There you go.
And so you have, anyway, this is an incredibly long-winded answer to your question, which is it's very fast-paced in this case.
Well, it's spread virally, as we say.
Yeah.
Smallpox is a virus.
Yeah.
So are YouTube videos. So let's end with what's a case of a slower but equally powerful kind of change that happens in this homogenization of everything?
Well, I would say one of the sort of big unknown stories is the spread of African grasses.
Spread of African grasses.
Throughout the Americas, these incredibly tough grasses. And one of the things that we're learning is that these grasses are these very thick kinds of grass. And, a big puzzle, to me at least, when I went to the Amazon and saw these areas that had been cleared for ranches and then they're abandoned, and it's, all that stuff that people say is completely true, how terrible it is. Well, why aren't the forests regrowing?
Yeah.
Because we knew they regrew, because the areas that were wiped out by the rubber trade have done fine. Well, a lot of the reason is that when the farmers deliberately planted African grasses.
Like what? What kind of grasses? These are grazing grasses.
These are grazing grasses.
For cows.
And I think Judy Carney at UCLA has written a lot about this. There's a bunch of people who've written about African grasses in the New World, and they initially came to the Caribbean in the bedding of slave ships and so forth. And they are this thick, spongy cover that chokes off regrowth. And so they've been a very, very effective means.
Doesn't permit savanna like you see in parts of Africa? Doesn't permit a savanna of widely spaced trees with cows under them?
No, they cut down everything and they plant some types of, these are short grasses, not the tall ones, and they are having a big impact, slowly spreading into forests as natural disturbances occur and the African grasses colonize it.
There you go. Carries on to this day. More to come. And two whole different kinds of solution sets that is coming along in this next book. Thank you for coming tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.